did this presentation a year and a half ago or so when we did the first series. And so updated a little bit for today. I will tell you that it covers a lot of ground. So we're going to go kind of quickly through things, although it will be easier since we have a smaller group today to talk through and be interactive. And I really hope that you will be interactive as we go through. Communication is really a very big umbrella that covers a lot of different things. I think those of us who work full-time in the communication field, one of the things that's frustrating to us is sometimes people think, oh, it's really easy because everybody can write and talk, right? So communication must be easy, but there is actually a lot more to it. And when it comes to a campaign, there is a lot more to it. And many of the things I'm going to share with you today are things that I learned in the heat of the moment in campaigns, kind of trial by fire. And so I'll share with you some mistakes that we made and some things that we learned as well. We're going to talk today about communication strategy. We'll talk about message development, talk a little bit about media relations, also talk some about digital media. I'm sorry, every time I walk past that, I get blinded, so I'll try to walk really fast across the center of the room. And so we'll cover all of those things, but that is really just the tip of the iceberg. So there's a lot more to know, but hopefully this will give you a good grounding in some of the basics. So we're gonna just a few more things on the agenda today. We're gonna talk about strategies versus tactics. You'll know if you don't know what the difference is now, you will by the time you leave here today. We'll talk about breaking your audience apart and really thinking about what the audience needs to hear, what their concerns are, and how you can relate your messages to them most effectively. We'll talk about how to develop good messages, effective messages, and then talk about some of the channels that are most commonly used in campaigns, not only traditional media, but also social media, paid advertising, direct voter contact, and collateral materials, all the stuff that you print, and then talk a little bit at the end about assembling your core team and the kinds of skill sets that you need on a campaign. So just a little bit about my background. The Twig Strategies that you saw at the beginning here is really just the name of my consulting business. It's not really a name that I put out there a lot, but I do consulting now. My background is that my background in political communications is that I did communications for Jonathan Wallace in both his special election campaign in 2017 and his 2018 race. I am working also in health communication by day. I'm a behavior change expert. That's kind of where my expertise is in how to persuade people to do things differently. And there's a lot of that in talking to people about who they're going to vote for and getting them out to the polls. And I am a consultant and was formerly the director of the Atlanta office of a nonprofit global health company called FHI 360. Before that, though, I was an academic. That's what brought us here to Athens. I was on the faculty of the College of Public Health for several years, and before that I was at the University of Tennessee, and I taught social marketing and health communication there. And way back before that, I was a public relations executive in New York City and in Central Kentucky, and I was also a producer at CNN. So my career goes back for about 30 years, wearing different hats in communication. So, and just one thing also up on the, get back to the computer here, we can go back on the slide. You may be wondering, well, sorry, I don't know what happened. Hold on. There is that. Yeah, there we go. Okay, that's where we want to be. So anyway, and this is just what Twig Strategies means. All right. So now your turn. I want to talk a little bit about what you're here for, what you're trying to get out of today. And as I said, I know a number of people in the room, but not everybody. So if you could say your name and whether you're thinking of being a candidate, whether you're thinking of working on campaign staff, or what it is really that you're here to learn today. That would be great. Why don't we start with you?
I'm Susan Schaefer. I'm contemplating running for probate court.
Excellent, okay. And any background in politics or in communication?
Not a long time ago. I worked for the House of Representatives.
Okay, great.
Worked for my congressman.
All right, well, nice to meet you.
And I'm Shirley, and I am not running to run for office in the foreseeable future. I just want to learn as much as I can about how to help. I've been the best at being a worker bee, going door to door, knocking doors for Deborah Gonzalez and etc. But yeah, I'm getting more involved in Indivisible, and I just am wanting to network as much as possible and hopefully recognize all these faces in the next couple of years on the campaign trail and things like that. So.
Excellent.
And then Hannah, and I'm with the Pony County Democrats, and just really looking at what I could do to help in a campaign coming up next election.
Excellent.
I'm Audrey Hughes, and I'm not sure what I want to do in the future, but I thought it's best to research and figure things out. So, what am I trying to get out of today? Just learning. Hard work.
Okay. Chuck.
I'm Chuck Rosenberger, and working with the County Democrats, and I may be running for office, and I definitely am going to be working in an election or two.
Excellent.
Andrew Ferguson, and as Francis mentioned, I'm thinking of running for Georgia 10. I worked on Chalice Montgomery's campaign last year. Learned a lot from doing that, and here to learn everything there is to learn about communications, so I can help my campaign if there is a campaign, or if I work on another campaign, to help that way.
Okay, excellent. Chris.
Yeah, my name is Chris Dowd. I'm looking to help out on different campaigns. Yeah, definitely interested in communications. Yeah, I was Don Johnson's communications coordinator, so I'd like to learn more.
Yeah, and I think all of us have crossed paths, also just helping out other campaigns, because I know in addition to working on Jonathan's campaign, I worked with Chalice on some things, worked with Deborah on some things, I met with Dawn several times, I think before you were on board, as she was kind of getting her campaign together to kind of help her along the way. And so that pooling of resources I think has been really important. So hopefully we can all help each other, whether running for office or working on campaigns as we move forward today. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the types of communication that we use in a campaign. There's a whole lot, both things as simple as a banner or a sign, and things as complicated as messaging. So, talking a little bit about. I think this was actually supposed to animate and go forward so that I wasn't clicking on all of these, but here we go. I want to talk a little bit about all these different kinds of communication. And really, as we think about it, there are so many options that one of the biggest challenges can be where to put scarce resources. Where do we, when you only have a limited budget and limited personnel to work on your campaign efforts, your communication efforts, where do you deploy those resources? And then how do you reach the right people? Who are the right people? Because again, there are lots of voters to choose from. We can look to our base. We can look to people who might be moderates. We can see if we can persuade some Republicans perhaps to vote for our candidates, or even just to stay home. But where do you put those resources, and how do you know? So one of the most important things that you can start with in communication, it's really a good place to start no matter what you're doing, is by getting a good idea of what your goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics are. And really that is so that you are able to have the big picture of where you're going and make some decisions about the small things that you do that can help you on that journey. So having the big picture view is really what we want to start with. And in the communication process, there's a sort of a 4-step process that works on almost whatever you're doing, whatever you're approaching in communication that can be very helpful to you. And it is, I like to abbreviate it so it's easier to remember as the RPI process, but it's research, planning, implementation, and evaluation. So the very first thing that we start with is that research and the planning part of things. Before you ever do anything, before you ever spend $1 on any campaign materials, you should invest time in research and planning. Then you implement, and then you evaluate and decide what worked, what needs to be tweaked, and how you do it in the future, perhaps differently, or what you will replicate in the future. So you can remember this RPI process. Oops. I need to move this forward so I can click it back more easily. My back button doesn't work on this.
Oh, I can help. I'll move and you let me know if you need me to back up.
Oh no, I'm good. I'm good right now. So okay. So let's talk a little bit about creating a strategic plan, doing the research that leads to the planning process and can help you make good decisions. I recommend that any campaign have a written strategic plan. It's not really enough to get together in a room and agree with people on what you're going to do, and then even if you've taken some notes, not really have a good idea of what you're doing. I think a written plan can help everybody in the campaign get on the same page, know that you agree on what you plan to do, and then it will help you walk through the steps of executing on that plan. A written strategic plan should include these basic parts. I know it looks like a lot, but we're going to step through this process today. The first thing is a situation analysis. So really, any plan that you begin with should first start with a snapshot of what the situation is currently. And why do you need to put that in writing? I mean, don't we all know what the current situation is? Well, again, it's to be sure that you are in agreement, that it's supported by some research, so that you have said, for example, like what's the current situation? How many registered voters do we have? What's their history of voting? You're gonna get all of that stuff. Is going to be part of your situation analysis, your current snapshot. From there, you can start to really analyze your audience, figure out who you're going to target, what their beliefs and values and behaviors are, and you'll be able to target them much more effectively once you have really done some analysis about the people. Then you're going to move into figuring out what your goal, your objectives, your strategies, and your tactics are. Then figuring out how you can measure and evaluate what you're doing, plotting it all out on a calendar or timetable so you know what you're doing when, and then finally thinking about the budget. How much do you need to raise or borrow or get in terms of in-kind donations? So what kind of resources do you need to make this happen? So this is a multi-step process, but really important, and again, really important to put it in writing if at all possible. So let's talk a little bit about these strategic planning terms that, again, I think are really, really foundational to what you're doing. You want to know, and everybody on the campaign should be in agreement about what it is you're trying to accomplish. And I know everybody is like, well, isn't it obvious we're trying to win the election? But maybe that's not all you're trying to accomplish. And in fact, in some cases, especially in districts that have been red for a long time, what you're trying to accomplish, you may know going into it that you cannot win that particular election, but your goal may be something different. It may be to raise awareness around an issue. It may be to mobilize voters for the first time. It may be to put Republicans on notice that We're out there and we're coming for them eventually. So your goal may vary. It may not just be winning an election. Your objectives are going to be the measurable part of these things. We're going to give some examples in just a minute. And then strategies and tactics will sort of hang from those objectives and be related to them. And again, whenever I can, I try to have mnemonic devices that help me remember these different things. So if you're thinking, okay, what do I need first? Is it the goal? Is it the objectives? Whatever. GHOST is how I abbreviate this or remember it. It's GHOST without the H in it. So GOST, goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics. Now, the language behind this actually comes from, and in fact, the language that we use to talk about campaigns, like the idea of a campaign, actually comes from military language. So, a campaign was actually something that was a military thing before it was a political thing. And goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics are often the examples that you will see to illustrate them come from the military also. So I'm going to use one of those examples, but I'm also going to relate it to the political landscape as well. So again, here's set a goal. What is the goal? The goal is the ultimate outcome, the purpose, more or less, of what you are trying to accomplish. The objectives are the things that are very specific and measurable. Those are the two most important parts of this. Specific and measurable. They should also be achievable, realistic, and time-bound. They're going to be things that you can actually measure and know whether you achieve them or not. So smart objectives are the measures that you put in place. Strategies are sort of broad approaches that you're going to use to achieve each objective. And then tactics are the tools, techniques, and things that you will use to achieve the objectives. So it's basically everything that you do, plan, produce, or attend. So I mentioned military examples. So here is an example of, and this is just made up. Francis is very engaged in the history community, and so this is not a real example from history. This is just a made up one. But let's say that an American goal, objectives, strategies, and tactics in World War II was something like this. Okay, the goal to win the war. Okay, we can all agree that was the goal. So let's say one objective, and there were lots of objectives. Let's say that one objective perhaps was to reduce Germany's ammunition stockpiles, and we're gonna make it measurable by saying we're gonna reduce them by 50%, and we're gonna make them time bound by saying we're gonna do it over the course of 2 months. Okay, that's an example of a smart objective, specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time bound. Okay, what would the strategy be? The strategy would be to make it impossible for Germany to receive shipments from its allies. So that's kind of a broad idea of what we're trying to do. The tactics are the things that the Americans would have actually done in this case. Maybe deploying soldiers to patrol the borders, maybe destroying ports and railroad lines so that ammunition couldn't come in, and maybe jamming German communication equipment. Tactics. There could be a long list of tactics, but those are a handful. So what would goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics look like in a political race? So again, this is just an example, but let's say maybe for a city council race that your goal is to improve the quality of life in your community. That's what wakes you up in the morning. That's what you really want to accomplish. Your goal may or may not be to have more progressive voices on the city council. I would think that would actually be very compatible with improving quality of life. But anyway, let's say that this is your goal. You're going to improve quality of life by getting some of your folks elected. Your objective, again, is it specific? Is it measurable? Is it time bound? Getting more than 50% of voters to identify rampant development as a key issue in the campaign. That could be an objective. by default, most objectives in a campaign are time bound because you have the election day as the end of the line. So you've got however many months of the election to accomplish that objective. Your strategy focusing on effects in the environment, schools, and traffic. And maybe you've decided on that after you've done some research to find out what voters really care about, that those are some things that you can talk with them about. There may be other issues as well, but you're focusing on those as your strategies that you're gonna talk with them about. What are your tactics? What are the things you'll do, the tools or techniques that you'll use? You will canvass voters adversely affected by development. Maybe you'll write a series of op-eds and letters to the editor. Maybe you'll buy electronic billboards and radio ads and create some social media memes and polls. Again, you might have a longer list, you might have a different list, but this is kind of how you lay it all out. Now, you may think to yourself, well, this seems, this is very nice, but we don't really have time to do this in a campaign because it's, we're really busy, we're under a lot of pressure. Why would you want to do this? Because one of the things that you will be under pressure about in a campaign is how to spend your money, how to spend your time. And you're going to be needing to make those decisions relatively quickly. You'll be needing to make those decisions, with getting pressure, sometimes even from people who've donated to the campaign, who are like, I really think you ought to be doing blah, blah, blah. So how do you make those decisions in the heat of the campaign? How do you make good decisions? If you have a plan, you can go back to the plan and say, does what I'm considering doing here, is it a tactic that actually supports a strategy that I identified in advance that will actually advance one of my objectives? Because sometimes it's not going to help you. So for example, maybe somebody will suggest that you really need to spend money in your campaign on, I'm going to say not money, but time. Let's say that that somebody says, I think your candidate should spend time going to schools in the area and talking to kids about these development issues, about the issue of rampant development or whatever. So you could go back to your list of objectives, strategies, and say, will that help us? Will it translate into getting greater than 50% of the voters in the campaign to identify rampant development as the key issue in the campaign? Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Maybe somebody is saying you should, that you need to spend money to get a booth at some festival. I don't know, I'll use the Human Rights Festival as an example. The campaign should spend money on a booth at the Human Rights Festival. Well, if this is your most important goal, most important objective, to get people focused on development as the key issue in the campaign, yes, you could do that at the Human Rights Festival, but maybe that money would be better spent on something else. So it begins to give you a way to make some decisions. So you think of these things when you're under less pressure. You come up with a plan when you're under less pressure, and it gives you some way to guide your decision making when you're under greater pressure. And that's really the beauty of it. And it sounds like a lot of work at first, but it makes your life so much easier if you have a plan and actually have mapped out what it is you're trying to do. And the examples I gave may not even be the best in terms of being clear no's, but you will get a lot of proposals to do things that will be a clear no if you go back and look at your plan. So having the plan can help you. All right, so coming up with the goal, it should be big and inspiring. And as I mentioned before, for a lot of campaigns, it's going to be getting your candidate elected. Maybe not, depending on what the realities are of your particular situation. Or maybe it might be just to get a particular person out of office. A better goal, though, that maybe is more inspiring, that's more mission-like, might be, achieving a more progressive society, protecting vulnerable people, saving democracy as we know it. So you can come up with a kind of goal that feels right to you. But it should be the thing that gets you out of bed every day, that gets your campaign inspired. And so whatever that is, that's your goal. And then, as I mentioned before, the objectives should be specific and measurable most of all, but also hopefully achievable and realistic. And by default, they're going to be more or less time-bound. Elections, though, may have multiple objectives. So when you're writing up your plan, you may have, anywhere from like 2 to 6 objectives that you can really realistically accomplish. And I'll give you some examples in a moment of what some of those objectives might look like. The universal objective typically in all elections is going to be a win number of some sort. How many people in here are familiar with the concept of win numbers? Okay, so about 2/3 of the room. Let me talk about it really quickly so that everybody knows what a win number is. Calculating a win number is, again, a super important part of the research and planning process that you go through, because it will help you know where you need to apply your resources and how much you need to invest in something. So to calculate a win number, you would take the average voter turnout for the last 3 elections in your particular race. It doesn't matter about other races, and you want to look for similar elections. So you wouldn't look for voter turnout in a presidential election and try to use that as your guide. You would look at similar elections. So maybe it's a midterm, you look at the last 3 midterms. If it's a city council race, you would look at the last 3 city council races. And again, hopefully something that would be that would show you turnout, not just in the presidential election year where turnout is going to be higher. So you're looking for the last 3 similar elections. You multiply that by the number of registered voters of all parties. I'll show you some numbers that will make sense in just a second. And then you take 50% of that number plus 1 vote, and you add a little bit of padding. So here's a hypothetical example. If in the last 3 midterms, the turnout was, and again, we're looking at all voters, was 16%, 11%, and 14%, that gives us an average of 13.66%. If you, in your district, had 10,000 registered voters, all parties, 13.66% would be 1,366 voters. That's how many turned out. So to win the election, based on that, you need 50% plus 1. 50% of that vote plus 1 vote extra. And then it's a good idea to add a little bit of padding. So using these numbers in this hypothetical example, to win this election, you'd need 752 votes. And so then you can start segmenting and breaking it down and saying, where will we find 752 voters? Who are our 752 going to be? And so then you might start doing a little more research and saying, okay, so of the people that typically turn out, how many people, what number of people can I expect who always turn out in an election that I can always count on? What are the number of swing voters? Am I going to have to get some Republicans to come to my side in order to get to 752, or can I do it with all Democrats? So you start to look at that and know, who do you need to be talking to? Who do you need to be communicating to get the number of voters that you would need to win the election? And the win number is something, even if you feel that you have an election you cannot win, that you're just like, we don't have 752 Democrats. Let's say in this district, we just don't even have them. That would not be the case, but most likely anywhere around here, you would probably have this, because we're looking at really low turnout. So you would have 752 people. They just might not be 752 reliable Democrats. But anyway, if you looked at that and said, I don't have enough, you could at least know how many you had, how you would reach them, who you would need to be talking to. So you can get a lot of information from this win number. So that's one of your first things that you want to look at. Then you're going to break down the audience in other ways as well. You were looking for 752 votes. What are some ideas about strategies that you could pursue? How would you get those people to the polls?
If you sorry, please.
And you can just shout out, but go ahead.
Well, I would look at how many confirmed Democrats you could count on for sure. And then say to yourself, well, what percentage of the Republican voters do I need to get, and how feasible is that?
Okay. Other ideas?
You have to do some canvassing and collect data along the way, and that would be helpful.
Okay. Find out maybe what people care about. How will you get 752 people to care enough about a particular thing, or how can you connect with them on a thing they already care about so that you can reach them? What other ideas?
You need to have a plan to get people to the polls that can't drive. And I noticed that in the last election. And I mean, I think we need to do a better job of an organized movement to do that. I know I did some canvassing this past time, and a lot of people just don't have vehicles. And I know Uber was giving free rides and stuff like that, but we got to do more. That is a hindrance to a lot of, well, to probably more Democratic voters than Republican voters,
Okay.
is transportation.
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, particularly the elderly that want to vote, but they don't feel comfortable driving, or they haven't renewed their license and they just can't drive. Because I ran into a lot of that when I was knocking on doors, and these people really wanted to vote, so they really wanted somebody to come get them. So I note that on the little minivan app, and I know the day of the election I was worried to death over, I've got to go to work, but I'd really rather take off and be driving these people I met.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't know, it's like, do we just send strangers there? Maybe that's something with canvassing for future campaigns in the future that our local Democratic Party needs to look at, is how can we connect maybe the same people that interacted with individuals and connect them on election day to actually physically get them to the polls. That's an idea.
Okay.
So if I were running a campaign, that's what I would try to do. But then the hindrance is you have people at work and you can't take off work to get a vote, or you're supposed to be able to, but many employers just don't allow you that time.
Well, the good news in this is that as you're building out your plan, so our objective, is getting that win number. The first thing that you need to think about is, what would your strategy be to get to that win number? And you don't need to get very specific on a strategy. Your tactics are going to be really, really specific in just a minute. But in terms of strategy, what you're mentioning is, we need to get more people to the polls and maybe make it easier for people to get to the polls. Chuck's strategy, and so whether we'll use Uber or we'll do whatever, that is going to be a tactic. We're going to come back to that. But we've got to get more people to the polls. Chuck's idea here is, we've got to figure out who these people are. Are they Democrats? Are they Republicans? Or whatever? We need to, and then so Adam, did you mention? I'm sorry, now I've lost my train of thought for a second. Somebody mentioned about canvassing. Maybe it was you that mentioned canvassing. We need to find out what issues they care about. So we've got to find that out. And again, how you'll do that will be something that you can discuss. But to know who the voters are, to help them get to the polls more easily, and to find out what issues they care about most, those are some broad strategies. And then we can figure out tactically what can we do to solve those problems. So, again, figuring out what people care about, you could canvass. You could poll people, you could do a telephone poll if you had the money or the resources to do that. You could post questions online and get people's responses. There are a variety of ways you could look at, but coming up with the strategies first is going to be the important thing. So here are some examples of strategies that you could apply to this 752 votes. Some of which we've mentioned. It might be that you're going to try to convert Republicans. It might be that you're going to try to neutralize Republicans. Just get them to stay home. If they don't come to the polls, then you can get that 752. The number of people that you in the 49%, becomes lower. So it's going to be easier for you to get to the number that you need. It might be registering more voters. We don't have 752 that we can count on. We need to get more people registered. So those might be some things, and then how you're going to do it will be your tactics. When you're thinking about strategies and tactics, the strategies are broad, tactics are specific, and the strategy is more important than exactly how you get to it, because you may change around your tactics. You may find some tactics don't work as well as others. You may need to change those, but you want to kind of stick with the strategy. You want to have that strategy in mind before you even start. This is kind of an example of what happens if you don't go into something with a strategy in mind. The idea here being that people are like, oh, let's go digital, let's do Facebook, YouTube, a mobile app, Pinterest. What are we going to do in all those channels? I don't know. We're going to figure it out later. No, figure out what are you trying to accomplish, and then you'll know, is Facebook or a mobile app or Pinterest the right way to do it, or should we figure that out by testing it? So I will share with you that in the 2017 Wallace campaign. When we looked at the win number, and remember, 2017 was really different than 2018 because we really took Republicans by surprise in Oconee County especially, but in that whole district, Republicans were kind of asleep at the wheel. They weren't used to being challenged, they weren't ready for any kind of competition, and so we were really able to take advantage of them. And so what we decided to focus on in 2017 was raising the awareness of Democrats as much as possible, both leaning and strong Democrats, and whenever possible, not tipping Republicans off to the fact that there was even a special election going on. Because a lot of people didn't know there was a special election. We found that out right away, going to people's doors and knocking on doors. We would knock on the doors of Democrats who would be thrilled to find out that somebody was running and they had no idea there was a special election going on at all. And this continued throughout the campaign, even when there were yard signs up and everything. So we were like, we don't want a single Republican who doesn't already know that this special election is going on to know about it. So we're going to be kind of on the down low as much as possible, but we're going to get as many leaning and strong Democrats to the polls as we can. And so that was our strategy, and we engaged with different tactics to do it. But if you remember nothing else, think about marry the strategy, date the tactics. The strategy is the more important thing. It's the more lasting thing. Your tactics may change over time, and that's okay. But you want to be really sure of your strategy going into things. So any questions on kind of that part of things as you establish your goal, your objectives, your strategies, and your tactics? It will start to become clear to you who your audience should be, and then we're going to talk next about how do you really get to know that audience and analyze them as you go. So any questions on what we've covered so far? Yes?
Do you mind circling back and hitting one more time the objective? I've got this. The goal is a SMART goal that's ambitious. The strategy is broad, the tactics are narrow. I missed the objective part.
The objectives are SMART. So the goal is the thing that kind of gets you out of bed in the morning.
Gotcha.
It's the big picture, to win the war, to win the election, to make it a better community, that sort of thing. But objectives are the things that you're at the end of the day, you're going to be able to know whether you accomplish them. And a good thing to remember is that the very word objective is objective. It's not subjective. So it's not anybody's opinion whether you accomplished it or not. It is objectively known whether you've accomplished an objective or not. So you set that up as something that you will be able to measure. We're going to get, we're going to make sure that at least 50% of voters see issue X as the most important issue in this campaign. You should be able to measure that. Now, whether you can realistically do that, you may not have polling capabilities or whatever. That's another discussion. But there should be some way of measuring whether you have met an objective or not. And so therefore, it takes it out of the realm of opinion, or whether, Francis thinks we accomplished it, I don't think so, Chris isn't sure. No, we can say whether we accomplished it or not. So that's one reason why you want to make them measurable. Other questions?
So the goal is the dream, the objective is smart, the objectives are smart, the strategy is broad, and the tactics are narrow. Have I got that?
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. And tactics, another way of remembering that, starts with a T. Tools, techniques, things, kind of different T, that you will use to accomplish your strategies and objectives. So it's the events that you hold, it's the rack cards that you print. Those are all tactical things. Okay, so other questions, or should we talk about audiences? And don't worry, we will have a little stretch break in a few minutes because I don't want everybody to fall asleep. All right, so let's talk about audiences. Often when, I work in communication every day, and often when you talk to somebody, whoops, that happened without me pressing the button, but that was the next slide up. Often when you talk to people about who is your audience, thank you. People will say, oh, the general public. And to that I respond, no, thank you for playing. There is no such thing as the general public. There's not a monolith of people out there who all think the same things or feel the same way or are looking for to have the same needs met. There are segments of audience, and unless you're talking to those segments, your one-size-fits-all message isn't really going to work. So don't ever think in terms of the general public. Even the general Democratic votership is too big of a monolith. You want to break that down into segments that you can communicate to in a much more focused way. And so that's why audience analysis is so important. And you want to really research the audience, understand the audience, and tailor the communication to the audience. And I don't know why this is moving along quickly. So I wonder if there's some kind of animation in there that's making it move forward. Okay, so these are the steps that you'll take to do your audience analysis. Segments are typically characterized by similarities and differences. So you want to actually break apart into different segments the different groups that you may be trying to communicate to, and figure out the way that they are alike and how they're different. So segments for a campaign might include not only somebody's likely party affiliation, and we have sort of imperfect information about that, but we can make some pretty good guesses based on Vote Builder. But also active versus non-active voters, other demographics, so all the usual suspects: gender, race, age, geographic location, income, education levels, family composition, their occupation or other affiliations, and then issues, of course, issues that people care about, like gun control, education, reproductive rights, civil rights, and then their relevant behaviors, practices, and norms may come into play as well. And it's by looking at all of these things that you can really begin to get very focused messages. For example, looking at occupation or other affiliations, you might decide that teachers are a group that you really want to focus on because they have some similar beliefs and values that you feel that you could relate to, that you could connect to, and that you might be able to mobilize them as one of your voting segments. Similarly, if you are focusing on people who have been active on gun control, let's say, you're going to connect with them over different things than you might somebody who is particularly interested in reproductive rights. I mean, there may be a lot of overlap, but again, finding out what people care about most is going to help you tailor your message to them. So you want to look at a variety of different characteristics of the audience as you think about how you're going to communicate with them. You want to break them into groups, and then you want to take their perspective and think about what are the things that they care about. And you're going to do this not only necessarily with likely voters for your candidate, but you may also do this thinking about Republicans as well. They're even thinking about the Republicans that would never ever vote for your candidate. But if you are able to take their perspective, to think about what are the things that they care about, one of the things that you may be able to do, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is to neutralize them. To get them to, is that the kitty meowing?
I was just gonna say, that's the cat doing that around.
She could, we could close this door if she wants to come in.
Anybody allergic?
Anybody allergic?
Is anybody allergic?
That's the wrong thing, he's terrified.
Oh,
So sweet. I don't think we're having any stragglers come in, so. Come on in, kitty. Come on, Murphy. She's like, I'm a Democrat. Good kitty.
I think Murphy will come in.
I think far more cats are Democrats than Republicans. I feel good about cats. So, okay. Come on in, Murphy. Okay, so you want to understand their point of view, and the more you can really put yourself in their shoes and think as closely as you can to the way they think, it's going to help you. It's going to help you attract voters, and it's going to help you get other voters perhaps just not to be as active against you, and that's a good thing too. So how do you plan for your audience research? First of all, you want to do some hypothesizing about your audience. So let's say, kind of going back to that, to the example I just used, when we're talking about teachers, let's say you look at your the composition of the electorate, and you're like, wow, there are a lot of teachers in Athens, Clarke County, or Oconee County. We feel like maybe they would be a good group to really focus on, and maybe we can even get to them through the teachers union or whatever. There may be some ways to really reach them. What do they care about? So you would first hypothesize. What are some of the things that we think would be important issues to teachers? What are they? What can you think of?
Fighting vouchers.
Yes, so yeah, fighting the whole voucher thing, especially if we're talking, let's say, just for our purposes, that we're talking about a state level race, a state legislator. So teachers really care about fighting vouchers. What else do teachers care about? Money. So what about money?
They need more money, give us a raise.
They need raises. They didn't get the promised, Kemp promised them a raise of a certain amount, give them less than that. He's gonna try to use that to his advantage in 2020. I mean, to his party's advantage. He's not running again in 2020, but certainly Republicans will try to use that. But it wasn't as much as teachers were promised, and it wasn't probably, frankly, as much as they deserve or as any of us would like to see them get. So that could be another thing. What else? Class sizes, yeah. Another thing that's related to money, but just in a different way. Having enough teachers in a particular district to have decent class sizes. What else? I know Adam is a teacher, so is anybody else in here a teacher also? Okay, so you guys probably have some strong feelings.
Protecting the pension.
Protecting the pension, yeah. I remember one of Jonathan's opponents in the special election said at some debate that he wanted to change teacher pensions to like a 401k style system. And boy, we used that a lot in our messaging. We had a lot of memes that we were boosting and putting out there on social media that were directed at teachers because we knew that was not going to be okay with most of them. So so there are a lot of issues, and you could think about the person you're trying to reach. What do they care about, and how will you connect with them? What will the message be that you will use? And then, if possible, you want to try to confirm or reject that idea through some research. So we've had 3 or 4 ideas right here for teachers right now. Maybe we would want to have some focus groups with teachers and actually talk to them and find out which of those issues is really the most important one. Is there another issue that we didn't even think of in this room that would be important to teachers and educators? So doing a little research to back it up is also important. But first you start by trying to put yourself in their shoes. Teachers were easy. There are some groups that are going to be a little harder to figure out, right? Where the issues may require some more digging. The research that you do can be talking to people. It can be talking to leaders of groups. So, back to the teacher idea, maybe you can't do focus groups, but you could have some phone conversations with leaders of the local chapters of the teachers union or at the state level. Maybe talk to a couple of lobbyists at the state level, get a sense of what they know, what data can they share. Or allies of certain voter segments. So you may find, that there's an advocate out there who is an ally who has something to say as well. So in the case of teachers, it might be talking to local parent leaders or other, folks at, the College of Ed at UGA or whatever, allies of the group that you're trying to reach. And then you can also do a lot of research in terms of looking at social media, news articles, and what has worked in other campaigns and what hasn't worked. So successes and failures in other campaigns can provide a lot of good data to you. As I mentioned before, if you have resources, focus groups and surveys can be good to do as well. I feel like that an underutilized resource, not only for communication research, but for other kinds of research on campaigns, in the Athens area are the students that we have at UGA, because there are many students who might be interested in for a class project, doing some polling, let's say, who could set something up on Qualtrics and who could, if you provided them the people to send it to, could put together a poll and analyze that poll in a way that would be very helpful to you. Might also check a box for them on a class assignment or even a thesis or dissertation work that they're doing, and could provide the data that you need. So there are a lot of ways to get that information. Finally, in terms of not finally, I have a couple more things to say about audience research before we take a break, but another technique that is sometimes helpful when you're trying to think about your audience is something called the BEHAVE framework. And this is just kind of a fill-in-the-blank statement that you can make that will help you get focused on your audience. So who are you trying to reach? What do you want them to do? What are the factors that influence their behavior? And what actions or outreach can you do that will most effectively address these factors? And so here it is kind of blown up big. In order to help the blank target audience do whatever the desired behavior is that you want them to do, we're going to focus on, and then whatever the good stuff is about, that you're going to tell them. We'll approach it through certain kinds of framing and approaches and use certain channels or methods to reach the audience. Here's an example. In order to help voters, that's the audience you're trying to reach, what behavior do you want them to do? Choose our candidate as the one to protect the environment against development. We will focus on, and then the factors that you're going to focus on are the negative impact on the watershed. Maybe this is back to the example of development and it having a negative impact on the environment. We will approach it through, so here starts to be your strategies and your tactics. We'll approach it through first-person stories from local fishing enthusiasts, homeowners, and doctors, and use shareable videos, that's your tactic, to reach the audience. So, filling this in can help you, again, focus on what are you trying to do, who are you trying to reach, how are you going to reach them, and with what sort of message. I mentioned before the idea of neutralizing your opponents, and not in the sense of, I feel like neutralizing them like in some movies, like science fiction movies especially, is like, killing them. That's not what we're doing. But this is a framework that was developed actually many years ago and was used by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in the Civil Rights Movement as a way to think about how to bring people, to make progress with people on the issue of integration and civil rights. And so it's got a long history, but let me explain kind of how it works. The idea here is that that whatever your audience, they fit into one of these categories. For us, our Democratic base are active supporters. There are also some Democrats who don't really get involved in politics, but they'll probably be out there to vote for you, especially now. They may be more mobilized and motivated to vote than before. But they're not your donors or your volunteers or whatever. They're just going to be passive supporters. There are a whole lot of people who are sort of in the middle and neutral, not necessarily neutral in their beliefs, but they're not really doing much of anything. And then on the other side here, you have your opposition. You've got passive opposition. Again, the same people, it's similar to your passive supporters. They're not really engaged in a conservative campaign or in conservative politics and Republican politics, but they're voting that way. They come out during election time. And then you got your rabid Republicans over here in the active opposition. So this spectrum of allies framework says that all you really need to do to be successful is to move somebody one space on this spectrum. And that's a win. Like, that's all. You don't need to get these people over here. You're probably never going to do that, and you would take too many resources. But what you can do is hopefully move your active opponents to more passive opposition. Okay, yeah, maybe they will stop writing letters to the editor. Maybe they stop donating and volunteering. They're still going to vote Republican, but they're not going to help the Republicans, and that would be good. Similarly, what if you can get some of these folks who normally just kind of trot off to the polls and check the Republican ballot, but they're not really that engaged? Get them to stay home, and so forth. Like, get the neutral people to at least be your passive supporters and convert some of your passive supporters into active support. So it's another way of approaching your audience. Instead of thinking that you have to accomplish so much with each segment, think about what little steps can I take, what incremental win can I get with a particular segment that will at least not have the opposition be so successful, and will hopefully add to your support as well. So another way of thinking about your audience. Questions about this? And again, we could. I think I'm gonna kind of power through instead of getting ideas. But you could think about a particular issue and how you would move people closer to you on the spectrum. And I will tell you that during the civil rights movement in the 60s, one of the things, for example, that was really important to SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, was getting more people from this neutral column to at least be passive supporters. One important thing that they did was all of those college students and young people who came to the South to work in the civil rights movement during the summer, they would come down and register voters and work on things. They actively encouraged them to write letters back home so that their parents and their loved ones were hearing about the injustices that they saw firsthand, and so that some of those parents and loved ones who were kind of neutral on civil rights, they were never going to be out marching, would move into the passive support column at least, and so forth. So that's an example of something small that can have a big impact if you're thinking in these terms of moving people along. And this is another way of thinking about it, like what can you do at each point for active allies, for passive allies, encouraging them, building relationships with them, and so on. So this is called the spectrum of allies, and you'll see out there if you Google that, you can get some more information on it. Last thing that I want you to think of when you're thinking about your audience, sometimes it can be helpful to really develop almost a character sketch of them. And this is something that writers and creators do a lot when they're developing television shows, when they're writing novels. They develop an actual character sketch and really think of the character in more than one dimension. And so that's another thing you can do here. You can think of, who is my typical teacher? Who is the typical teacher in a Clark County classroom or in a Coney County classroom? Those answers would be different, right? The challenges that they face are going to be different. So thinking about who they are, what they do, why they do what they do, and how you're going to approach and persuade them. Thinking of that character sketch, and then going out and finding out, like, is this character I've created really accurate? Is this true? What questions do I need to ask to find that out? And sometimes it's even helpful to kind of act that out and do some role playing when you're developing your messages, to be that person and have somebody say your message to you and respond as you think that person would respond. So thinking about that can be really helpful in developing your approach to any given audience. Okay, so just kind of tying this all together. Like everything else that I've suggested so far, your audience analysis should be in writing. It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be in paragraphs, but I think actually just bullet points is great. Like where you really think about, like, what do people care about? What are their concerns and issues? Where will I find them? How will I reach them? And you want to test your assumptions by going out and talking to them or observing them in some way. So that you're not dealing in assumptions and stereotypes, but in real facts. But it does help to have some assumptions or hypotheses to start with, to give you a jumping off point to ask those questions. All right, now it's time for a little stretch break. If anybody needs to use the restroom, why don't we take like a 5-minute break? And when we come back, we're going to be actually working on some messages and developing some. So use the restroom, get water, get whatever you need, pet Murphy, and we'll come back in like 5 minutes.
Murphy's a Republican operator.
A comment that just came up is the idea that in a nonpartisan race, like you're running for it's probate judge, right? Okay. You're running for probate judge. Actually, you do have to reach everybody, right? Like, I mean, you want, and people are going to vote, Republicans are going to be voting for you and Democrats. So what do you do then? How do you segment your audience then? And we're going to talk about that in the next section that comes up when we talk about messages, because we're going to talk about how you develop messages for certain kinds of audiences, and then the idea of framing, which is choosing different parts of a message or different elements of a message depending on who your audience is. A not as nice way of putting framing is to think of spin, but that's not really what we're doing here. We're just choosing what to connect with people on. In much the same way that if you're talking to your boss about a raise, there could be a lot of different things you might emphasize in talking to that person. You could emphasize how much you need the money, or how high your credit card statement is, or lots of different things. Those might all be true, but you could also emphasize what value you bring to your company or your organization, or how or what you have achieved as an employee or whatever. That's framing. That's just, you're choosing what are you going to emphasize and what are you going to not talk about with that particular person. And so we're going to talk about ways that you can do that as well. And you cannot go outside. Do we need to leave this open, or?
I don't think she can push the door
I
open,
don't think she
but
can either, actually. I think she'll be fine. She might just like sniff.
she likes sniffing
Yeah.
at maybe.
Okay.
She's dreaming of being out there.
Okay. All right. So let's talk now a little bit about messages, and I've got a handout for you guys, and we'll maybe take a few minutes to work on developing some messages as well. There are three basic steps to an effective message, and you will hopefully leave here knowing what those three steps are, those three components of an effective message, and be able to create a message really about anything, and including in your personal life, because you can use this for almost anything. Negotiating who's gonna take out the garbage with your significant other. You can use this, you can also use it to talk to voters about a lot of different things. So three different steps. One of them is the bottom line. Second part is the proof, and the third part is making people care. So with these three components, you will have all the makings of a persuasive, effective message. This is something that you will see that media organizations use a lot, this sort of three components of a message. If you're talking about the New York Times, for example, they typically start with a bottom line, which is in journalism terms called the lead, and it gives the basics of the story usually in one sentence. They will also provide you some proof, and they will also give you an example or tell a story that will make people care. So, for example, they might say, they might start with the bottom line. The lead of the story might be the FDA today approved an arthritis medicine, following successful clinical trials. Maybe that's the bottom line. Then maybe they would give you some proof. The medicine was tested with over the last 5 years with hundreds of people who suffer from arthritis. 20 million Americans suffer from chronic arthritis. I'm just making that number up. One of them is Sue Smith. She could not get out of bed, for the last 10 years. Then she was participated in this clinical trial, and now she is able to walk to the bus stop. Whatever. So they would give you some reason to care. They would humanize it in some way. If you were talking about a TV media outlet or a lot of magazines, I've got Fox News up here, but I've also got CNN and MSNBC, and this is true for any of the media outlets on television. They typically reverse the order. They typically start with something that makes you care. They start with that human interest story. Meet Sue Smith. She hasn't gotten out of bed in the last 10 years. She participated in this clinical trial. Like 20 million Americans, she suffers from arthritis. She was one of 150 people that participated for the last 5 years in this clinical trial. And the trial was so successful that the FDA today approved this medicine, whatever it is. So they would reverse the order, but they would have all of those elements there. Something that makes people care, something that backs it up with numbers or statistics or facts, and then a bottom line that would be really the gist of what it is that they're saying to you. And so in developing a message, you're going to put together these three parts. The bottom line is the first and really one of the most important parts. You want to boil your message down to its most essential element and get it into one sentence that people can easily remember, that you can easily repeat. Maybe you repeat it in a different phrasing. You change it up a little bit so you don't sound too robotic, but you're going to repeat that key message over and over again. And you can also think of this as the takeaway message, the one thing that you want people to take away from what you're saying, the one thing you want them to remember. Typically it may be it may be behavioral, it may be something that you want them to do, but it can also be something that you want them to know or be aware of, or something that you want them to feel, something that you want to use to help change their attitude. Why is this bottom line message so important? Because it may be, amid all of the clutter of information, the bottom line may be sort of the sole survivor, that one thing that people can remember. They may forget everything else. And we know that when people see television interviews, forgetting is a big problem. And so this is one reason why crafting that bottom line, providing that bottom line so that they can remember it is so important. Because studies have shown that when people see a television interview, after about an hour, they have forgotten 40% of what they've heard. After a day, they've forgotten 60%. And after a week, they have forgotten 90% of what was contained in that interview. Of that tiny sliver that they remember, what do you think is part of that? The portion they do remember includes mostly how the person looked. So that's going to be very memorable to them. How they came across, about 35% of what they remember is how they came across. And only about 7% of what was 10% of what they remembered, only about 7% of that is content. So it's just a tiny sliver. So if you can craft that message, say it multiple times, be sure that you are consistently delivering it in different channels so that, they're hearing this message on social media. It's also what I said when I appeared on the Lady B radio show. It's also what it says on my rap card, whatever. If they are seeing that in multiple places, hearing the same message over and over again, chances are they will remember it, or they will take it with them. And that is really important. An effective bottom line should really be short, just one sentence. It can be repeated over and over again. It should be distinctive and not, confused with other messages or other candidates. So, your bottom line shouldn't sound the same as Brian Kemp's bottom line or Houston Gaines' bottom line. It should be something that is distinct and memorable and associated with your campaign. It is not the same typically as a slogan. Slogans are great. Slogans have their place, and most campaigns develop a slogan. We're talking about messages that are typically about issues, and so you're thinking of boiling it down into one sentence. Back to the example I used way in the beginning, if you were trying to get people to think of rampant development as the most important issue in your city council race, you might craft a bottom line that says something like, the greatest danger to quality of life in our city is rampant development. Like, that's an example of a bottom line that people can remember. And if they had heard that enough times, and you're running against somebody who's voting yes, more development, yes, we don't care if you're going to build 17 fast food restaurants, on this land that is currently like agricultural or not. I'm only like slightly fictionalizing what's happening in Oconee County a lot of the time. So anyway, if that was what you wanted to get across, you could boil that down to one sentence that people could remember and could associate with your candidate or your campaign. And here's another example, like a bottom line around universal health care. Universal health care is a no-brainer. It would cost us less as a nation and make people healthier. That's really simple. Like, that's a good takeaway. And it combines actually the people element and the financial element, which are sometimes the way to reach two segments with one message, because you'll see that for a lot of people, it's much more resonant for them to talk about the dollars that something would cost or would save than about the lives it would cost or would save. And so, knowing when to pivot and when to emphasize one or the other can be important, but if you can combine them in a message, that's even more effective. Okay, I said the second part of the message is the proof. And so that is where you bring in some statistics or facts. Sometimes it might be an anecdote that is factual in nature, or maybe you bring in some kind of counter argument ahead of the fact that is going to help counter something that somebody might say. Maybe going back to the healthcare example, maybe if you're expecting that somebody would say, well, but we just can't afford to give universal basic healthcare to everybody. What would you say to that? Well, you could say something that you could back up with facts that would be something to the effect of, we're already paying now for the healthcare that people have to get, that we're subsidizing as people who are insured, or the lost productivity that it costs us. So you could have some stats ready to go. You could even put them out there as part of your message ahead of time if you can anticipate what somebody's objections might be to your message. So statistics or proof are good. Now, one thing I will say is that we as Democrats love statistics and love facts. And as is more and more apparent, we love them a whole lot more than Republicans do, because they don't even care if things are true or if they're factual half the time. But the problem with facts and statistics is that they're not very persuasive to people. They're not really emotional. And just showering people with facts or responding to their objections with more and more facts is actually not a very good recipe for persuasion. So you want to have some facts at your disposal, but you also want to have something that is really gonna strike an emotional chord with people. And that's where we come to the third part of a message, which is making people care. Make me care. What do you do to make people care? You think about the 3 questions that anybody is quietly asking in their mind when they hear your message. Because everybody is really responding with these 3 questions internally. So what, who cares, and what's in it for me? So the answer to making somebody care is to anticipate these questions and be able to tell them a story, give them an example, or relate to them in some way that will answer these questions, that will answer the response of, so what? Who cares? What's in it for me? And you can sometimes, if you're not sure how to create this part of the message, I think a very helpful phrase you can use is what that means to you, or why that matters is. And that will, if you lead in with that kind of phrase, you can usually think of what comes after it that could make people care. Sometimes I'm just laughing at Adam with the kitty who's like right on top of his keyboard and like so excited to have all this attention. If you want me to, I can move him if he's.
Oh, it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm sorry to distract you.
No, that's okay. Anyway, so you want to have the response to why people should care. So you're really answering these questions from the audience's perspective. When they're thinking, so what? They're really thinking, why should I pay attention to this? I'm worried about a lot of other things. I have other priorities. Why should I pay attention? Is this something I care about? Is it worth the hassle? How does it help me or my family or my community? That's really what people want to know. And so we have to help them answer those questions as part of our message. Some ways to help people care. As I said, you can say what that means to you. That's kind of a feature benefit approach that salespeople use all the time. If I was trying to sell you this mug right now, Francis's coffee mug, I might say, and it's made of stainless steel. What that means to you is it can go in the dishwasher and blah, blah, blah. Why should you care that it's stainless steel versus plastic? There might be 5 other things I could have said just then, but I'm saying the feature is that it's stainless steel. But if I just left it at that, why does that matter? It's more expensive than a plastic cup. It's more, what about this? What about the ceramic cup that I have that is Also not disposable and not made of plastic. Why is stainless steel better than that? So you want to explain to people why what you're telling them is better. I mentioned what that means to you. Anecdotes and stories really work here, bless you. The other thing that you can do is let other people tell the story. So whenever you can find a person who's willing to tell their first person story, whether it's recording a video or just letting you take the facts of their story and say, so-and-so is a perfect example. So-and-so is a teacher, I keep using like Sue Smith. Sue Smith is a teacher. She's a perfect example of why we need smaller classroom sizes in our county because, and then you tell the story from her perspective. She had this experience in the classroom or blah, blah, blah. You're telling a story, letting someone's example speak for you. So here it is, kind of put together, put all together, and I have a little handout for you that summarizes the 3 parts. As you're creating these, remember that you can use them in any order. You can start with the bottom line and go through the proof and the make me care. You can start with make me care. You can start with proof. You can mix it all up. You just want to be sure that you have these 3 components of the message that you're creating. So thinking now, if you had to, let me talk about framing, and then we'll do a little practice with the messages. I mentioned framing earlier as picking and choosing the part of something that you will emphasize versus what you won't emphasize. Now, I feel like this is something that you have to be careful with in political life because you don't ever want to be accused of telling one audience something totally different than you've told another audience, right? You don't want to be like talking out of both sides of your mouth and, this group will never hear that I said this to them, and this group will never hear that I said this to them. We're talking here about something that is an internally consistent message. Like, you're not hiding something from one group or telling one group something different than you're telling another. You're just choosing to emphasize the most important points that you think will be most relevant to someone that you're talking to. If they ask you about other parts, you're going to be fully honest with them. But you're going to pick and choose what you lead with and what you focus on most. The frame is it's excluding or emphasizing, and it's going to change the way someone views the message. The next example I have, the next slide up, I love because it's so unexpected. But let's just do a little bit of practice with this. If you were framing, has everybody in here seen The Wizard of Oz? Okay. If you had to in one sentence tell somebody about that movie, what would you say? Let's get a couple of examples.
Midwestern delinquent kills woman with house.
So, you've kind of stepped on what we're gonna have next, but that's okay. Midwestern delinquent kills woman with house is one possible framing of that story. What would be a more traditional framing?
Little girl loses her mind and
That's where the heart is.
Girl discovers there's no place like home.
Yeah, girl goes to Fantasyland, kills an evil witch, discovers there's no place like home, and comes back. Whatever. So there might be different ways of framing this. The next example is very similar to what Adam just said. Transported to a surreal landscape, a young girl kills the first person she meets, and then teams up with 3 strangers to get her dead. We have chosen a different way, perhaps, of framing this story here than you might traditionally choose, but it just goes to show you that you can frame something in many different ways. So think carefully about the frame that you use, what you're going to emphasize, how the words that you're going to use to talk to somebody about something, because it will make a big difference. This doesn't sound like something I would want my children to see, but obviously it's a movie for kids and could be framed in a much different way as well. So, okay, so now it's your turn. Let's take a moment and maybe, since we have six regular participants. I don't know if you guys are. I don't know whether to consider you regular participants if you want to work together. But why don't we work in pairs for like 5 minutes, really quickly, to develop a 3-part message. And hopefully I've gotten the facts of this right. I meant to go double check and read more on it because I've been kind of following it from a distance. Athens Clark folks, can you tell me, is this correct?
Chris,
Mayor
we've
Gertz
been
is
following
proposing
the
to
story pretty closely.
put $150,000 into the budget to pay inmates, is that right?
I don't think it's really for that in particular, but I think we can go with this as a
We'll go with
reasonable.
that, okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, so if you were developing a message, let's say that this was absolutely accurate and true. Mayor Gertz proposing to pay them for their labor. What would the bottom line message be? What would a proof point be that maybe that you could put into that? And why should people care? Why does this matter? What's in it for them? So what? Who cares? What's in it for me, right? So why don't you quickly just come up with what would your bottom line be to say to people, and what proof point might you want to put in there? You may not have that number in front of you right now, but you could say we would want to know X, we would want to put this in our message, and why should people care about it? So let's take like 5 minutes and develop that in groups of, so why don't we do it in groups of 2? So you guys can turn around and work together, you guys can work together, and the folks in the back develop a quick little message, bottom line, proof, and reason to care.
I'll make it. I'm really nice, I'm generally like that. I would say, bottom line message.
Because
In that,
Why should people pay?
something
Local Clark County applicants.
Well, obviously there's,
Yeah.
did something, so I'll harm an issue with more treatment.
People shouldn't be paid for.
It's the United
that's
States.
the problem.
Work, you get paid.
That's the,
Yeah.
It's also a debt to society
That's the bottom line.
because of something done. I mean, maybe it's to pay the reparations you have to pay, but maybe that's behind it.
Well, no, the money that we get in the cash would be for buying things like fun time for home and, personal. You know,
That same work details.
that's
so
an
how
assumption.
counter.
So they're using that line, right?
You just
Bottom
do
line
it entirely and
message,
reframe it
papers
and leave it out your frame.
for labor,
Proof
for work. Proof is this is United States and
The counter argument, the prove it kind of part.
pay people for their time
I think they do that.
and their labor and
Don't
their
be
services.
Don't make anything, don't talk to them, blah, blah, blah.
Why should people care?
Otherwise, you could do it yourself.
Of course.
But they are the guys that are working out.
Many free
Yes.
services for the
Yeah.
community.
If they were.
It might could be used as an incentive for positive behavior that are incarcerated.
What about how much work does it want to pay?
Might could make them less likely to reoffend in the future because they learned something while they're in jail.
Like, it's immaterial, but there's
Yeah.
immaterial that they're.
It's a rehabilitative measure, hopefully reducing future incidents.
Right, the fact that, like, no matter what you ride, killing somebody or whatever, that shouldn't keep us from getting paid for work. We're in prison because of what we done. We're not being forced to work.
Bottom line message is, people should be.
Oh.
Not jail, murders.
Right. That's what, that's what we were.
You have a lower level
They do.
criminals unless they're just but usually
just
unless they're
all about
being held prior to conviction or something.
True.
But Oh, but it was the
I
guy.
wanna be.
Right, that's true, that would be.
So prisoners clean the highway.
They work on
Can we tell them
on a stay.
it's not costing you?
Because that makes us an outlier, right? That makes us
Pick up trash on
non.
Maybe not.
highways,
Let's
on
do
the sides of
something.
highways.
That's better work.
Make me care. Well, let's put it this way. Will people care
Well, then.
Sometimes they have them working
that
at
one
animal
little
shelter.
fair one is unfair?
Your staff is.
Do they have that level of empathy on the people?
I mean, that's definitely one way to. You have to have a lot of respect and humanity to them that way. We don't know exactly what they're doing.
Share a story about a prisoner.
If you didn't have the inmates.
Keeps them connected to family and friends.
More
That a person does.
for you taxpayers.
Lower incidence of reoffending.
And I guess the town, instead of just saying, well, we don't bail it out, or just go back.
Which is sad.
Prisoners
You're helping frame it by
are able
saying
to
these people are going to be paid under the statistics that show that
more often.
when they are released, and will be able to, then they will be able to sort of have their own
Jobs.
It'll then have when they transition finances back into society. That's why it's a good thing.
Okay, I'm gonna direct your attention back here for a minute, so you can use this board to write things down. And I absolutely know that nobody has come up with a great message in 5 minutes. So, I mean, you may have something good started, but it would not be enough time to create a message. But we're just gonna kind of hear what you have and talk through some of the challenges here. So let me hear from each group about what your bottom line was. Do you guys, wanna tell me what you came up with?
That all people should be paid for their labor.
Okay, all people should be paid for their labor. Okay, next group.
Honest work deserves honest pay.
Okay. Honest work deserves honest pay. Sorry, not the fastest writer. Okay, next group.
Same thing, people should be paid for fair labor.
Okay. People should be paid for fair labor. Okay. And next group?
It's a variation. People should be paid for what they perform.
Okay. All right, and I think one of the things that, that this exercise shows us, if nothing else, is that you all pretty much nailed, what you would want to say, what would be an essential part of this, and you said it in 4 different ways. When you're creating a bottom line, having a couple of different ways of saying it can actually be really good, because again, you don't want to say, but what can we do about it? The county needs to set aside money to pay people. So those are some different ideas. What about proof? What would you want to, what kind of fact would you need to throw in there? What would you need to know to create a message around this?
Something about, evoke the labor standards that we have, and for nearly a century, we've endorsed and made it law that every work deserves a minimum wage.
Okay, so labor standards or labor law. I'm gonna abbreviate it as labor law, minimum wage. You might wanna invoke that. What else? What other kinds of statistics or proof or facts might you want to work into this message?
Georgia is one of only 5 states that allow totally $0 mandated.
Okay, and I'm gonna abbreviate that in a sort of sarcastic way as Georgia exceptionalism. Yeah, you
Won't
know,
be the first time
George is
this
lagging
week.
behind here, you know, it's backward. Yes, and
I just, no, it just won't be the first time this week.
right, yeah, George is trying to be exceptional in every way possible, reproductive rights, whether, yeah. Okay, so it could be something like that. What about just, you know, you would want to have the facts at your disposal of how many prisoners are working how many hours? You know, what are they contributing? So there might be something about, you know, the number of prisoners and hours. You wouldn't want to create this message without knowing that and being able to back that up. This doesn't mean you're going to use all these facts in the same message, but you want to have a few proof points so that with different audiences you can choose different things. Is that another handout?
I was gonna say what that work would cost if you contracted it out.
So the actual cost of the work. Adam, you had your hand up also.
I wonder if this might be a good angle to take with teachers or that kind of thing to say, those are hours they could have spent studying in the jail. They could have spent learning to try and better themselves in other ways.
Right. So to use an economic term, the opportunity cost. What are we not doing with those? You know, the time that those inmates could be spending. There might also be an angle here, and I mean, you know, we could probably come up with a long list of these, but these are some good facts that different audiences would care about more. You know, teachers are going to care about what you just said. You know, maybe somebody else, maybe, you know, attorneys will care about the legal aspects of it, whatever. Maybe you want to talk to people about the jobs that like the fact that this is, like, in a sense, you know, competing, it's driving down wages for other people. If we get labor for free from people, not only is it an abuse of their civil rights, their constitutional rights, but it is something that would be, that means that we're not paying somebody else to do that job. We're getting the labor for free, and so it's depressing everybody's wages. That might be another angle. There might be multiple angles here. Having a list of facts at your disposal, but just bringing maybe one or two of them out in a particular setting is what you want to aim for, because different facts will resonate with different audiences. What about why people should care? Depressing wages is actually one thing, again, that you might talk to some audience about, but what are some other?
Well, we talked in terms of what the money that they could make would do, how it would benefit them and benefit everybody. So if they all get this money put into some kind of savings account for them, then they can get access to it when they get out of jail. They need money.
And transition back into society.
That might work in Clark County, but we don't care about that stuff in Oklahoma County.
You know, but the flip side of that is it could lower recidivism, right? It could lower the you know, so I mean, again, depending on which audience you're talking to, those are two sides of the same coin. You are easing the transition into society so that people are less likely to end up back in jail for whatever reason, you know. So that would definitely be, so talking about the transition, talking about recidivism, those are some angles here. What else?
Well, like, what does it cost to jail them versus what does it cost to pay them? Same idea, like, so if we could pay them this much now for their labor, which might reduce, you know, recidivism, and then they're not back in the labor, they're not back in the prison system where it's cost this much to.
Right, so yeah, lower the cost and maybe like provide some stats of future prison time or whatever. So we could have something there, those stats, and then we could actually, you know, maybe put a finer point on it here to say this is a way to spend money now to save money in the future. This is, you know, we're going to save taxpayers' money. Okay, so saving future costs, and then obviously, what we haven't touched on here is there's a huge civil rights component, right? That this is, and a racial component as well, especially when we're talking about African American prisoners not being paid for their labor. And again, that's something that you're going to choose which things are going to be most resonant with which audiences, and and create a solid argument that links a bottom line with at least one fact, with at least one reason that people should care. And so we could make a longer list of any of these. This is the process that you go through, and then the idea is to brainstorm as many as possible, and then develop some different ways of talking about it. Figure out which ones are going to be your best ways, maybe by talking to audiences and getting a little bit of feedback before you put your messages out there, and then choosing which one will go on your rap card or in your op-ed or whatever communication you are developing. So that's just a quick example. Let me go on to some other stuff, because we've got a lot more stuff still to cover. Are there questions about this message development process? I mean, it's really just a way of breaking down something that a lot of people kind of understand intuitively, and yet, quite often, messages will be missing one of these components, and they really sort of miss the mark because of it. Because you need the cognitive part of things to, the facts and the proof. You need the emotional part of things to make people care, and then you need something that is memorable that people can hang on to and remember. This is another model that I'm just going to quickly show you, which is another way of thinking about messages. Which is that you're moving people along sort of a stage. This is called the stages of change model, but it's that you're moving people to become aware of a problem, to make an intention, to do something about it, to actually take action, and then to work to sustain whatever action they've taken. And this is something that is originated in health behavior, but applies very much to voting behavior too. That you need to think about, where is your audience in terms of even knowing about this? Are they even aware of it? Do they even know about this issue that we just talked about? You have to make them aware of it, get them to thinking about the pros and cons, encourage them to do something about it, which in most cases is going to be voting, then actually go vote, and then in terms of the maintenance, reminding other people to vote, feeling good about their decision or their behavior, and hopefully repeating that behavior in the future. So think about where your audience is in this process, and when you develop your messages, give them the part of the message that they need to become aware, to get motivated to action, or to feel good about the action that they've taken. All right, so that I'm going to skip that last slide because we've already kind of worked through a message example. Are there any questions about messages? We've talked about planning and research. We've talked about so your goals, objectives, strategies, and tactics. We've talked a little bit about audiences. We've talked a little bit about messages. Now we're going to quickly talk about communication channels. The point of the next few slides is really not to tell you what channel is going to be best, but to sort of lay out what some of your choices are and begin thinking about the pros and cons of different communication channels. I think, can you hit it back thing? Okay, thank you. All right, so when you're thinking about communication channels, by the term channel, I don't mean like radio and television channels, although that is included in the list. I really mean all the different ways that we communicate with people. So billboards and ads and radio interviews and social media memes and everything else. The literature tells us, the campaign, political science literature, that voters need repeated contact. So they need to get a message that you've developed in many different channels, and they need to get it more than once. There's not an exact measure, but a lot of people who work in political campaigns will tell you that a voter needs to hear the message anywhere from 5 to 9 times over the course of a campaign for it to really resonate. So that you need to be touching that voter, they will say, 5 to 9 times over the course of a campaign. Sometimes I think that those numbers are just kind of pulled out of the air. I don't really know how we know for sure. But the point is that one contact from you is not going to be enough. So the more ways that you can reach them in the more different channels, the better. Personal contact is always going to be the best. People are always going to respond better to a one-on-one conversation they have than to a mailer or to an ad that they see. But you can't make personal contact that many times with every voter, so you've got to have some other ways to do it. Lots of available channels when you think about it. There's it's not just traditional media, but and not just social media. Lots of ways to reach people on an interpersonal level. And then when we talk about collateral, those are really all the things that you might hand to somebody or stick in somebody's yard. So collateral can be anything that people can print out, that they can hand to a friend, or that they might see in terms of an ad. So in the Wallace campaign, in our 2017 campaign, in the special election, I will tell you that we did 25,000 mailers over the course of that campaign. Knocked on about 7,000 doors, and that was in a 6-week time period, so it was quite a few. We also phone banked. We also did handwritten postcards to rural voters. Let's think about how many people in parts of Clark County and a lot of Oconee County, but certainly lots and lots of other places in Georgia, you can't walk up to their door and knock on their door because they have a 2-mile-long driveway and a gate and dogs and and maybe a shotgun at the end of the gate, and you can't walk up there, you can't approach them. So how do you get to them? You might have to write them a postcard or call them up. Radio advertising, media interviews, yard signs, special events. We did a texting campaign that I'll tell you about in just a minute using a platform called Hustle. And then, of course, social media. In that campaign, we only used Facebook and Twitter. In the regular campaign last year, we expanded and used Instagram as well. But we could have done even more on social media. And then, of course, there was a website. There were rack cards, which is the term for those cards that people leave on your doors. If you haven't heard that term or are unfamiliar with it. And then, of course, candidate forums and events like that. I'm going to talk quickly about traditional media and social media, and a little bit less on the other stuff right now. But these are going to be the main ways that most campaigns are going to reach out to people. And when we're talking about the media landscape in our area, in Athens and Oconee, now this would not apply to District 10. It gets a lot more complicated because I know I worked a little bit with Chalice on that, and it's big. And before that, I actually did the media outreach initially for Indivisible, and so I know what the 10 counties, the 25 counties look like in terms of landscape, and it's big. But if you're just talking about Athens and Oconee County, it's a pretty small universe, and that's good. It makes it easy. It's easy to get to know the people who are the gatekeepers, the decision makers at these different media outlets. And I will say that there are some, I don't know if everybody's familiar with all of these that are on here, but there are some that are actually quite important players in our landscape that might get forgotten if you weren't as familiar. So for example, the Red and Black, a lot of people don't maybe think of them because they're a student-run newspaper. They're a really important source of political reporting during election time. And so, you need to make sure that they're a part of what your part of the group that you're reaching out to. Same with like UGA Grady News Source. It's a television outlet that students are responsible for producing. So really important. Coney County, we have a blog that is one of our main sources of information. And then lots of good radio programming in Athens, particularly on WXAG. There are a number of shows that reach a predominantly African American demographic, but not exclusively African American. A lot of people who are tuned into politics locally listen in on these shows, and so it's a really important resource. And then there's some others, including the conservative Tim Bryant, which we did not say yes to in Jonathan's initial campaign. He did do one interview on Tim Bryant's show in his regular election campaign last year. But we sort of avoided that, because remember, way back I was saying that our strategy was not to let Republicans know there was even a special election. So when Tim Bryant kept calling and saying, "Can you come on my show?" we're like, "Nope, sorry, too busy, much too busy." So anyway, but you can pick and choose from these, but you want to make sure that they're all on your list. The most important thing to remember when you're approaching media organizations, like the ones that I just showed you, is that they care about what is newsworthy. They are not there to be your public relations outlet. They are there to provide news for their audiences. And so you want to be in tune, just like you want to be in tune with your audiences around messages, you want to be in tune with reporters and producers about what is newsworthy, and be sure that you give them something that is. And there are several different elements of newsworthiness that you can remember and kind of use as a test for what you're pitching to the media. These are, let's see, yeah, I think that's all of them here. So I'll just quickly go through. I think a lot of them are pretty self-explanatory. But basically, if something is of the moment, it's really timely, that's a good reason to pitch it. If it has high impact to the audience or to the readership. Loss of life or destruction of property is something that's newsworthy, probably not going to come up that much in a political campaign. But again, if you have an issue that involves that, that makes it newsworthy. So you want to talk to people and elevate that in your conversations with the news media, so that they know what you're talking about will matter to their audience. Proximity, things that are local, things that are relevant, anything that involves conflict or controversy. So all of those are, politics by nature is going to tend to be local, involve conflict or controversy, and hopefully you can make it seem relevant to people. Emotion, prominence, novelty, something that's kind of new and unheard of, can be something that is newsworthy, and something that's useful to people. So you want to think about what is it about what you're saying that is new and different, that is relevant. How can you make it really resonate with your audience and show them how to do it? And I was a producer for 8 years and got pitched every day. And I will tell you that that the two challenges that producers and reporters have is that they're constantly being inundated with stuff, and they're super busy, which in a way kind of makes them seem lazy. But usually it's that they're overwhelmed with what they've got going on, and you can help them. You can help them by showing them what is a good story, and you can help them by kind of cutting through the clutter and showing them again what is a good story. So you're really helping them do their jobs if you can tell them what's newsworthy about what you have to say. To get coverage, you want to make sure that you have a newsworthy story, or that you tie it to something that's timely. So for example, if you wanted to talk about an education issue, if you were running for office right now, or if you're working on a campaign right now, and you wanted to talk about an education issue, a way that you could make that newsworthy would simply be to time the pitch about that story, about that message that you've developed around back to school. right? Because every news outlet in America is looking for back to school stories. So give them a story about teacher pay on the week that school is starting. And that's going to be more likely to get coverage than if you pitch that in the middle of July or in December or whatever. So you're thinking about like, what do they need to do their job and how can I serve it up to them in a way that is going to make it easier. You can also create a news hook. When we have campaign launches or kickoffs and we have big events, we're just creating news hooks. We're making a news story out of something that would otherwise not be newsworthy. So you can have an event or make something happen if you feel you need to do that. But you'll be better off if you try to work with news hooks that already exist. Same thing with, to use a sad example that I wish we didn't have so constantly. If you have a gun control message, it's going to be much more resonant after there's been a story about a shooting in the news. The unfortunate thing is that seems to be every other week, but you will get a lot more attention paid to your story if you time it around something that it relates to. If you can't think of anything that's newsworthy about your pitch, go back to the drawing board and figure out a way to make it newsworthy because they don't want it if it doesn't fit one of those criteria. So you need to think of another way to tell the story if you haven't been able to think of how it's newsworthy. If you're writing a news release or an advisory, you want to make sure it has news value. You also want to start with the most important elements or facts first and then move on to the less important. Make sure that it's engaging to the journalists, that it tells them the 5 W's and the H, so the who, what, when, where, and why, and how of the story. Be sure, and again, you'd be surprised at how many people write a press release and it's like leaving out basic facts, like where is this event happening, or who is this for? So be sure that you have all of the facts and follow this inverted pyramid style that puts the most important stuff first. Don't try to hype things. Be straight with people and give them a good release. And just like you did with the messages, think about from the reporter's perspective, what is their audience going to be asking? Their audience is going to say, so what, who cares, what's in it for me? Help them answer those questions for the audience. Oops, I think I just...
So you said put the most important things first, but what would be an example of something that's more important than something else?
I'll use like an example of let's say you're writing a press release about your candidate announcing their candidacy, right? And you've scheduled an event around it, and that's great. Think about what is like the most interesting part of this candidate declaring, and put that in the very first paragraph. And so if I were writing something about Jonathan Wallace, let's say, I might put in the very first paragraph that he's a newcomer to politics who's living as a software developer and who was who felt like he needed to step up because nobody else would. Like that would make him new and interesting rather than just because otherwise somebody might get that release and be like, yeah, so what? Another white guy's running for office, whatever. You know what I mean? So what can differentiate your candidate? You would put that early in the release, and then put the other stuff later on. Where the candidate lives, where the other things about them could come later on. And that may not be the best example, but I think you want to think about what is most important and figure that the person may not read past the first couple of sentences. So you want to hook them in and engage them in those first couple of sentences. It's not like writing something where you're gearing up to a big crescendo. You put your crescendo right up front. Okay, so, a little bit less relevant in local news situations, but I will say, I'm going to just speed through some of these. I will say that when if you are talking to a reporter or producer on the phone, the very first thing that you should say is, are you on deadline? And if they are, you should get off that phone or as quickly as possible. If somebody is on deadline, they are not going to hear or process anything that you're saying. So if you've called somebody up out of the blue and they're on deadline, say, great, call you back later, and just hang up. And they don't care why you were calling or whatever, unless you're calling about whatever the breaking news story is that they're on deadline for. So, it's very important. Media folks are pretty overwhelmed and under-resourced these days, particularly in local media. And so be respectful of their time and don't waste their time. Okay, another thing I want to say is that to have good media relations, you need to build a relationship with the person and be somebody that they can trust. So when they contact you, get back to them quickly. Be helpful. Be the person who is able to answer their questions, not the no comment person if you can at all help it. Recognize that they're on deadline and that speed matters. And if you don't return their phone call or respond to their email, perhaps somebody else will who doesn't have the same message that you want to put out there. So know that they will fill the void if you're not responsive to them. However, it's also important to kind of recognize the boundaries of trust. Just because their kids go to school with your kids, or they go to church with the candidate or whatever, there needs to be a little bit of a distance there when you're talking about the job that they're doing, and no conversation is ever off the record. So don't, even when you know somebody well, you have to have some boundaries in that relationship. And don't ever ask that a conversation be off the record. If they don't like your story, back off, don't burn bridges, don't take the rejection personally. During the entire special election campaign in 2017, the Athens Banner Herald, anybody want to guess how many times the Athens Banner Herald did interviews with Jonathan or Deborah? 0.
None.
0. I can't even tell you how many times I pitched them. I called, I emailed, probably if we had had a little bit longer than 6 weeks, I would have actually gone physically to their office at some point. But we didn't get any coverage. They had like 2 articles during that whole election cycle about the campaign that were not very comprehensive or good in any way, but they never interviewed the candidates. So, you just don't take it personally. You don't know what's going on in their end of things. So let me move on from media relations, which you are doing, in which you are pitching a story and they're going to cover you at no cost, to talk a little bit about paid advertising. I will say that even though in journalism it is a no-no for paid advertising to have any impact on the editorial side of things, in local journalism it doesn't always work that way, and you may actually even be under pressure from a reporter that you're calling up to also take an ad in their newspaper or on their website. The implication, seems like maybe they won't be covering you as much if you don't, but it's not really supposed to work that way. But it's a weird thing that happens when you're talking about local journalism. So you will be hit up to take ads. You may consider other kinds of advertising besides like media outlets. You might consider billboards or other things. Really think hard about whether that's the best use of your resources. Remember that a lot of paid advertising is going to be seen by the entire electorate. So in a sense, all those Republican eyeballs that drive past TV. So those are some things to think about when it comes to paid advertising. I also want to mention, yes?
So is it true that maybe your staff person who's doing media relations is not going to be your staff person who does advertising?
In an ideal world, they should be 2 different people.
Okay.
Yeah. And
that was a mistake that I made. I didn't know. I thought we had a volunteer media person, and I wrote that person an email like, how much does it cost for us to put an ad in Flagpole? And that person wrote back, I don't know. I was like, okay, who am I supposed to ask? So I think that's something for people to know, that
So in an advertising agency that does this kind of stuff all the time, the person who does the media buys is very different from the person who pitches a story to a reporter. And they don't, not only do they not have those relationships, they don't have those facts typically, and it's actually good to have that dividing line so that you don't get the situation of the reporter pressuring you to buy the ad, or or the ad person saying, well, this would make a great story or whatever, and it doesn't feel quite right. But so two people are better than one person to do that if possible, but probably most small campaigns, it'll be one person with habits. I want to mention really quickly, and I got some things that I can pass around, but since we're running out of time, I'm not going to pass them around right now, but I have them at the end. I want to mention just the idea of also being careful about the news outlets that you deal with. This is, if you Google this, you'll be able to find it. Vanessa Otero is the person that developed this. This is sort of an analysis of different media organizations, and not only whether they skew left or right, but how careful they are, how factual, and whether or not they're purveyors, basically, of fake news or not. And if you're in a position where you're dealing with national media at all, this is really important. If you're in a position where you're sharing articles on social media on behalf of your candidate, this is also really important to think about which media organizations have a bias and which ones don't. And so I'll, like I said, I've got some handouts about this that I can that are to share, not to keep. They'll pass around some laminated things that show this a little bit up close. But that's one more thing that we have to think about in the world of media is what organizations' biases may be and how much we can trust them. And this is a little bit of a blow up of the way this is categorized. This is on the liberal side of things. You can see that even the liberal things that we may agree with and that may have articles that are quite interesting and make us angry or make us upset, like Slate or Daily Beast or whatever, are not necessarily in the highest esteem in terms of their fact checking and fact reporting and that sort of thing. So you want to be careful about that. I want to turn now quickly to social media because it's such a big part of campaigns these days. And I don't know that I need to convince anybody here in the room, but I always put these stats up just in case people are like, I don't know, how many of our voters are really on social media? Well, the answer is a lot of them. At least 70% of all US adults are using at least one platform. Even people over 65, there's a huge number of them. And there's not a lot of difference in usage by race or geographic location or gender. There are some differences with regard to education level and income level, but almost every platform is still represented at most levels on the income education spectrum, except sometimes the very lowest, depending on what platform it is, may not be represented there as well. So people making less than $15,000 a year, for example, may not be as well represented on a platform like Twitter. But when you jump up to the next income category, actually you start to see more and more people on Twitter and other social media platforms. Social media content is, I think a lot of people mistakenly think that it's going to be really easy to create that content. It can be challenging day after day. Now, as you get really close to the election date, you'll have more to talk about. But in terms of sustaining things, for example, if you had an election, if there was an election for this fall, right now during the summer, it would be hard some days to think of things that you could put out there that would be new and interesting and keep people coming back. So you have to think and plan ahead about what kinds of stories are you going to put out there. Obviously, you can create posts and share other people's posts, but you should think also, ahead of time about the kinds of photos you want to get. Like, oh, we found, for example, that it was really successful getting photos of people's kids putting up yard signs. People loved that, and people would share it, and it promoted a lot of activity on Jonathan's site. That was just one little thing, but you want to have a lot of different ideas up your sleeve. So maybe thinking about how can you get people to interact with the use of polls, or how can you roll out different planks in your platform on social media, and what's your calendar going to be for that? I have highlighted in red here videos captioned when possible. The reason I've highlighted that is because videos are the thing that almost every social media platform's algorithms are designed to push to the top of people's feeds. So you will get a lot more mileage out of a video than you will out of a graphic that is, attractive and has the same message in it, because like Facebook's algorithms, for example, say, "Oh, yay, it's a video. Let's show that to everybody right now." Whereas the meme that you created with a graphic or a photo or whatever might get a little bit less traction and be shown to fewer people. So videos, when you can include them, are going to get you a lot more eyeballs looking at your feed. You want to think also, there's a little evergreen tree. You want to think of some evergreen topics, like things that you'd like to talk about that aren't really related to any point in time. They're going to be fresh all the time. They're going to stay evergreen. They won't spoil. So thinking of some of those ideas, like, again, to give you an example, for Jonathan, one of our evergreen posts that we had queued up for a while before we used it was something about him coaching soccer, because we had some good pictures of coaching soccer, and we were like, we'll use this on a day that's slow. We had it ready to go. You don't want to spam people, so try not to get too much out there in any 24-hour period. 2 to 3 posts a day is absolutely the maximum that people can take in. The rest of it's going to kind of get lost. And really, 2 to 3 posts a week is probably going to be sufficient if you're not right on the right at the election day or the couple of weeks before it. So anyway, plan ahead, plan what you're going to do, develop a daily calendar, and have a plan for it is my best advice with that. Now, one really important thing I want to mention is you will have options to boost posts, to pay money to get more people to see the posts that you put out there. And it can be a great way to reach people. I mentioned earlier that we had boosted some posts for teachers. We had some teacher-specific messages. That's one example of one group. But you can find people based on the issues they care about, their occupation, whether they read liberal or conservative publications. You can do it by geographic area. You can say, I only want people in this 10-mile radius. You can get very specific. But if you're gonna do that, and it is a good idea to do that, you have to register with Facebook ahead of time in advance in order to be authorized as a person who can make those kinds of political posts. So just be aware of this as you're doing your planning. You don't want to be 2 weeks before election day and deciding to boost posts, because you will not get authorized quickly enough to make that happen. The other thing is you want more than one person on your team authorized to make posts, because sometimes, randomly, Facebook will just disallow somebody, and you can't really figure out why that's happened. But I know multiple people and multiple campaigns where like suddenly one of their people was unable to make boosted posts. So be sure you have a couple of people that can do that. And it's very reasonably priced to do this as well. You can say, oh, we're going to spend $10 to boost this post, and you can cap the budget and keep it at that. And it may be really worthwhile to reach the particular group that you're trying to reach. You can also say we want to spend $1,000 if you want. Be sure that you have chosen the amount that you want to spend, because there was I won't mention names or even the circumstance. There was a couple years ago somebody in Athens Clark who boosted a post but didn't cap the amount and ended up with a really large bill that person was then trying to get other people to pitch in to help pay for, because they didn't cap this. So be careful with your budget, but it's a good way to get things out there in front of people. Be careful about questionable content that could provoke people. Be sure that everything is well sourced from a source you can depend on. Think about, whether is it too negative, is it too edgy? Sometimes we would have something that was really edgy and funny that we would actually just ask friends of the campaign to put out under their Facebook or Twitter handles, rather than it coming from the candidate himself. So, think about what you're doing. And here's some examples of a few posts that we had during the special election. An example of a child Mira sign. Those were great, really popular. We did a lot of writing on cars and vehicles, and the photographs of that seemed to be also popular. So we would put them out there. Lots of how to vote and getting people mobilized to go out to the polls. So those are some examples. You can also grab fun photos from online and make a meme out of it. This is from Carpool Karaoke, James Corden. And so you've got James Corden and Michelle Obama. And can somebody help me? I always forget who this is. Does anybody recognize?
Missy Elliott.
Yes, thank you, Missy Elliott. Missy Elliott. And so this was just them riding in a car, but it made a fun little thing about getting a ride to the polls. So, lots of ideas. Whoops, I just skipped past the teacher posts that I had that we had used. We did a lot of teacher posts, and we tried to show a lot of different, different teachers, like different races, different genders, whatever, like so that something would resonate with people and they would be like, yeah, this looks like me or this feels like me. So this was another example. Okay, so there's one that was this we boosted to people who had an interest in gun control or preventing gun violence. This is an example of one, give Trump the finger, this one, that we determined was too edgy to put out there under Jonathan's name, but was a fun thing that would mobilize people, and so lots of other people shared it as well. So I will say that if you're trying to create memes like the ones that we just saw with photos and stuff, there are a lot of ways that you can do it. Memegenerator.net is one thing that you can use that will just put it together for you right away. Canva is another software that's available. You can sign up for a free 30-day trial, or maybe there's a longer trial even that you can have for free. But anyway, it's a good one. You can search for memes that are already created by somebody, especially get out the vote memes. Or you can use PowerPoint. I use PowerPoint a lot to create these, because you just drop a photo onto a slide, save the slide as a JPEG, and crop it, and then you're done. So that's an easy way to do it as well. I mentioned that we had also used texting, and I want to just give a shout out to this really quickly. We used something that I know other candidates in the area have used also, called Hustle, which was a way to send automated text messages to people. They're not fully automated. You do have to have somebody kind of pressing the button 2,500 times or so. But it's easy to do. It's easy and kind of fun to do. And we found it to be an effective way to reach people. It's kind of funny because I don't really think I would want to get text from a campaign, but I have talked to people, including I have a relative who's in her 70s who lives in the Atlanta area, who was receiving texts from a campaign in Atlanta, and she was really excited about it. She was like, it's like they know me. And I was like, yeah, they're using Hustle probably. But anyway, she was like, and I felt like it was a good reminder and whatever. So, it may be well received by a lot of people. And if it's not, you can stop. But this is a way that you can reach people for just a few pennies per person. All right, last thing, we're like 3 minutes over, but I promise I won't keep you more than 5 more minutes. I just want to say, in terms of your campaign team, Thinking about the different hats that your communications part of the team will need to wear is very important, the different skill sets that they will need. You need a person who is dedicated to communication. I mean, that's bottom line, every campaign needs that person. They need that as much as they need a campaign manager and a person who directs the field operations and probably a volunteer. So they're really one of your critical roles in the campaign. If possible, you can also benefit from having dedicated social media managers, ideally at least one person for each platform you're using. So this would be like in a larger campaign. And depending on how large, like if it's a congressional campaign, you might even need to have several people dedicated to each channel. Try to find people who know those channels. Like it's not a good time for somebody who's never done Instagram to learn about Instagram. You should find a college student who uses Instagram every day or a high school student and get them to do it if you don't have another person who comes with more experience than that. But they might do a fantastic job for you. So that's you want to look for people that know the platforms. You also probably need a communication researcher kind of person who can gather facts, gather information, help you write your platform. Maybe that's your dedicated communications manager, maybe it's another team of people. Writers and proofreaders are important, and you may even want to have people whose job is to write op-eds or other kinds of things for the campaign. So again, more people there would be great, but your dedicated campaign manager might have to wear that hat. A web designer you'll need at least at first, and a graphic designer you'll probably need throughout the campaign, definitely at first to create your logo and your kind of look and feel. But if you've got somebody who can come on board as needed for other things, that is an ideal situation. And I know we had several people who were fantastic local folks who wore some of these hats for us in both campaigns. I know in the regular election campaign, our graphic designer, we actually put her on a retainer for 4 hours a month. We said we're gonna pay, we need you at least 4 hours a month. We're just gonna pay you whether we use you or not for this. And we used all of that. I mean, we needed that. So, we were lucky that we were able to pay somebody to do that work, but you'll need someone who has those skills. You can find people everywhere. I'm sure that just talking with folks, you'll make a lot of these connections, but don't forget UGA has a lot of students, graduate students too, that would love to have this experience as part of their portfolio, and so you can reach out to them. And I'm not sure what was on that other slide, but thank you. And this is just, this is a quick thing to say. There are a lot of ways that you guys can work together, the campaign team. We found it to be very effective to use Slack as a way to communicate within the campaign. If you don't know much about Slack, you can look online. It's something that kind of combines many of the features of email and social media and instant messaging in a way that is good, and it's not too hard to learn. It's pretty intuitive. We use that as our back channel means of communication. We also had a 2-step approval for all content, where at least 2 key people in the campaign had to lay eyes on everything that went out, including every social media post. So we had 5 people who were part of that group, but 2 people of those 5 had to give a thumbs up to everything that went out the door. And we didn't have any major gaffes. So it was a good system, I think, to protect from that. 2 sets of eyes is always better than 1. And be careful with who you give access to your, especially social media, because it's going to speak for your campaign, and it's very hard to backtrack from mistakes that are made. I don't know if you saw that news story a month or so ago about there was a Republican somewhere in the Midwest who had basically said that I'm trying to remember what he said about that being poor was basically a character flaw, for people or something terrible like that. He put that out there on a social media platform. Now, I'm not saying that that's not the way a lot of Republicans think, but it was probably the last thing they wanted to put out there publicly. And so having some measures in place to protect some crazy message from getting out that you don't want people to know or would be very inappropriate coming from your candidate is important. All right, so that is just about it. Just there's a picture of Jonathan crossing the finish line in 2017. Sadly, he did not have the same success in 2018, but I think we learned a lot of good lessons from that, and hopefully those are lessons that are being passed on to all of you. So questions, I don't want to keep anybody that needs to leave, but I'm happy to answer questions either up here or one-on-one. Questions or comments? Is there anything that you wanted to know that we didn't cover in this jam-packed 2.5 hours? Okay, well, thank you all for being here, and if you have questions, this is my email, KarenHilyard@gmail.com, 1 L and a Y, my name. So feel free to get in touch with me if you have other questions. And I'll see you guys.